Night Chill Audiobooks presents Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, written in 1994 by John Barrett, read by James Ross Spencer. Chapter 10. It ain't bragging if you really done it. On the whole, the 30-odd residents of Monterey Square regarded their neighbor Jim Williams with a respectful friendliness. Several were on his Christmas party invitation list. Others were more wary and kept their distance. Virginia Duncan, who lived with her husband in a townhouse on Taylor Street, for example, still remembered the chill she felt when she came out of her house 2 years ago and saw the swastika hanging from Williams' window. John C. Labey, a retired architect, had found a number of acrimonious battles with Williams, all concerning what Williams described as Labey's destructive incompetence in matters of architecture and historic preservation. So Mr. Labey had no use for Jim Williams. But the Labey-Williams feud was a mere quibble compared with the Cold War that raged between Williams and his next-door neighbors, Lee and Emma Adler. The Adlers lived in an elegant double townhouse that occupied the other of the two trust lots on the west side of Monterey Square. Their side windows looked directly across Wayne Street at Williams' parlor and the ballroom above. It was the Adlers' howling dog that had prompted Williams to play his thunderous version of César Franck's Pièce Héroïque on the organ. But the dog bark was only one sour note in a whole medley of bitterness that existed between the two households. Lee Adler, like Jim Williams, had played a central role in the restoration of Savannah's historic downtown. His approach was entirely different, however. While Williams' efforts had involved his own restoration of houses, Adler had been an organizer and fundraiser who left the actual restoration work to others. Adler had helped create a revolving fund for the purpose of buying old houses that were in imminent danger of being razed. The houses were then sold as soon as possible to people who promised to restore them properly. Lee Adler's accomplishments had been so successful and his participation so energetic that he had emerged as a national spokesman for revolving funds and historic preservation. In recent years, he had turned his attention to renovating old houses for poor blacks. He toured the country making speeches. He was elected to the board of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He lunched at the White House. His name appeared frequently in the New York Times and in national magazines. Now in his mid-50s, Lee Adler was probably the best-known Savannian outside of Savannah. Lee Adler's national prominence inspired a fair amount of resentment in Savannah. It was widely felt, in Savannah at least, that Adler's manner was bombastic and peremptory, that he was an autocrat, and that he stepped on toes needlessly. He was accused, openly and behind his back, of taking more credit than that was really due him for the Renaissance of Savannah. It was said that he hogged the limelight, that he was insincere, and that his only interest in historic preservation was to use it as a means to gain fame and make money. Jim Williams was among those who felt this way about him. Adler and Williams were outwardly civil, but just barely. Adler had been a member of the Telfair Museum's Board of Directors when Jim Williams was president, and from time to time their animosity spilled out into the open at board meetings. On one occasion, Adler accused Williams of stealing furniture from the museum. Williams denied it and countercharged that Adler was trying to blacken the name of anyone who had more power over the museum's affairs than he did. Eventually, Williams engineered a plot that forced Adler off the board, and Adler never forgave him. Williams was contemptuous of virtually everything about Lee Adler, his taste in art, his word of honor, even his house. A visitor once rang Williams' doorbell by mistake and asked if Mr. Adler was at home. Williams told the man, "Mr. Adler doesn't live here. He lives in half the double house next door." Lee Adler was no less disparaging of Williams. He believed him to be fundamentally dishonest and said so. Furthermore, he suspected the Nazi flag episode was more than a light-hearted attempt to foil a crew of movie makers. He let it be known that a letter addressed to Williams from the John Birch Society had once been delivered to his house. Adler was critical of Jim Williams' decadent lifestyle, but he was just curious enough about it to get out his binoculars and spy on one of Williams' all-male Christmas parties. Adler had clumsily forgotten to turn out the light behind himself and was silhouetted in the window. Williams saw him, waved, and drew his shutters. In spite of all this, there were restraining factors that kept the two men on a civil footing most of the time. Lee Adler was Leopold Adler II, the grandson of the founder of Adler's department store, Savannah's answer to Saks Fifth Avenue, and his mother was a niece of Julius Rosenwald of the Sears and Roebuck fortune. Emma Adler was the sole heir to the biggest block of stock in the Savannah Bank. She had been president of the Junior League and was an active member of several civic organizations. So the reality of the situation was that both Jim Williams and the Adlers were prominent, influential, and rich. They lived in such close proximity and moved in so many of the same circles that they felt obliged to remain on cordial terms, which was why, despite his loathing for them, Jim Williams always invited the Adlers to his Christmas parties, and why, even though they detested Williams in return, the Adlers always accepted. Early one bright April morning, Lee Adler came toward me with a broad smile on his face and an arm outstretching greeting. "Shake the hand that's going to shake the hand of the Prince of Wales," he said. Mr. Adler was making a jocular reference to an article in the morning paper announcing that he and his wife would be traveling to Washington at the end of the week to meet Prince Charles of England. The Adlers and the Prince were to participate in a discussion of low-income housing. Adler assumed I had read the article, and of course I had. Most of Savannah had read it, and to judge from Mr. Adler's ebullient mood, he either did not know or did not care what certain people were saying about it. "It's just another of Leopold's cheap self-promotional ploys," Jim Williams said, but the rolling of eyes and clearing of throats was not limited to people who disliked Lee Adler. Catherine Gore, a lifelong friend of the Adlers, also found the news distasteful. "I would like to meet Prince Charles too," she said, "but I would never stoop so low to do it. Low-income housing indeed." Adler and I were standing in Adler's office on the ground floor of his townhouse. This was the command post from which he directed his many projects in real estate and historic preservation. A telephone rang in another room. Somewhere a copy machine churned. The walls of his office were decorated with memorabilia of Adler's role in the remarkable renaissance of the Savannah's historic district. The photographs documented parallel transformations that had taken place over the past 25 years. Savannah regaining the splendor of its youth, and a youthful Lee Adler progressing by stages into silver-haired middle age. Adler wore half-moon glasses and a pale, rumpled summer suit. His speech was a soft, cajoling drawl. We had met a week earlier at a garden party given by a local historian, and Adler had offered to take me on a tour of Savannah to show me stage by stage how Savannah had been saved from the wrecker's ball. As we got into his car, he let me know he was aware of all the carping going on behind his back. "Do you know what the saying for the day is?" he asked. "It ain't bragging if you really done it." He gave me a meaningful glance over the top of his glasses, as if to say, "Never mind all the backbiting you've been hearing. It's sour grapes." We pulled away from the curb and began moving through the streets at 10 miles an hour. As we did, the visual treasures of Savannah flowed by in slow motion. Townhouses, mansions, shadowed gardens, well-tended squares. "Picture all of this deserted and empty," said Adler. "Imagine it, run-down windows broken, weatherboards unpainted and rotting, shutters falling off, roofs caving in. Think what the squares would look like if they were nothing but hard-packed dirt instead of grass and azaleas and beautiful landscaping. Because that's the way it used to be. That's why Lady Astor called Savannah a beautiful woman with a dirty face when she came here after the Second World War. That's what Savannah had allowed itself to become. And what's frightening is that while it was happening, nobody gave one goddamn." A truck behind him honked its horn. Adler pulled over to let it pass, then kept moving at a slower pace, continuing the story of Savannah's decline. Until the 1920s, he said, Savannah had remained basically intact. An architecturally exquisite 19th century town. But the flight to the suburbs was just then beginning. People moved out of the lovely houses downtown. They cut them into apartments, tore them down, or just boarded them up and left them empty. In those days, all the money was being funneled into the development of the suburbs, which was fortunate for Savannah in one respect. It meant there was no clamor to bulldoze massive areas downtown for housing developments. Nor did Savannah have superhighways slicing through the center of it the way other cities did, because Savannah was not on the way to somewhere else. It was geographically the end of the line. In the mid-1950s, almost a third of the old city was gone. Then in 1954, the owners of a funeral parlor announced plans to knock down a dilapidated tenement so they could use the space for a parking lot, and a number of concerned citizens rose up in protest. The tenement happened to be Davenport House, one of the finest examples of federal architecture in America. It was a shamble at the time. 11 families were crowded into it. 7 ladies got together, Lee Adler's mother being one of them, and saved Davenport House and restored it. They then formed the historic Savannah Foundation, and that was the beginning of Savannah's salvation. In the early days, historic Savannah had a vigilant committee that sounded the alarm when an old house was about to be demolished. but the committee had no power to prevent demolition of houses or even to gain a stay of execution. All it could do was try to find some sympathetic soul who would buy the endangered building and restore it. Most of the time, the house came down before the committee could find anybody to save it. It soon became clear that the only way to save old houses was to buy them, and that was when Lee Adler became involved. "I was having breakfast one morning," he said. "It was December of 1959. I read in the newspaper that a row of 4 townhouses on Oglethorpe Avenue was about to be torn down. They were lovely, built in 1855. They were known as the Mary Marshall Row." It was the same old story. A local wrecker had bought the houses in order to knock them down and sell the bricks. The bricks! You see, they're Savannah gray bricks, which are larger and more porous than ordinary bricks, and they have a very soft and beautiful color. They were kilned at the Hermitage Plantation on the Savannah River. They're not even made anymore, and you can't duplicate them. They were selling for 10 cents each at the time, more than 3 times the cost of any ordinary brick. Anyhow, the wrecker had already demolished the carriage houses, and the townhouses themselves would be gone in a matter of days. Adler pulled over to the curb on Oglethorpe Avenue in front of Colonial Cemetery. Across the street stood a handsome row of 4 brick townhouses, each with a stoop of white marble steps leading up to the main entrance on the 2nd floor. The bricks were a muted grayish red. "There they are," he said, "fully restored. When I came to look at them that day, the windows were out, the doors were gone, and the steps were in bad shape. The bricks from the carriage houses were piled in the backyard. I went into one of the houses and climbed up to the 3rd floor and looked out at the magnificent view, and I thought, this can't be allowed to happen." Adler paid a call on old Mr. Monroe, the wrecker, and told him he wanted to buy the whole row. Mr. Monroe told him he could get the bricks to him in 6 weeks. "I don't want you to touch those bricks," Adler replied. "I want you to leave them right where they are." Mr. Monroe agreed, but said Adler would have to buy the land, too. He could have the whole row, bricks and land, for $54,000. So Adler and 3 other men signed a note for it. Then they wrote a prospectus and took it to the historic Savannah Foundation, which had 300 members at the time, proposing that the foundation buy the row at a cost of $180 a member. "My idea," said Adler, "was that the foundation would resell the houses to people who would agree to restore them." Historic Savannah went along with it. That was the beginning of the revolving fund. It happened that the poet Conrad Aiken had lived as a child in the house right next to Marshall Row at number 228, the house in which Aiken's father had shot his mother and then himself on that terrible morning in February 1901. Having spent most of his life up north, Aiken wanted to come back and live his last years in Savannah. So a millionaire friend, a man named High Soberluff, bought and restored the house on the end of Marshall Road for Aiken and his wife, Mary. It was number 230, the house next door to the one Aiken had lived in as a boy. "When work was completed on the house," said Adler, "the contrast between it and the other 3 was startling. I went to the phone and called the newspaper and said, 'Do you want to see a miracle? Come on.' So they came over and they did a big feature on it in the Sunday edition. That was in February 1962. We had an open house the day the story appeared. It rained, but something like 7,000 people came through the house. They wore the shellac off the banister. We let them go into the unrestored house next door, too, for a before and after comparison, and they saw for the first time how a dilapidated wreck could be transformed into something marvelous. When that happened, we started to get some interest. People began to see the potential. They began to think about moving back downtown. Of course, it didn't hurt one bit that Savannah's greatest man of letters, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, was leading the way. We resumed our drive. Adler pointed out dozens of houses that had been saved, describing in detail their once fallen condition. The porch on that one was completely gone. That house had bright green asbestos sidings and aluminum awnings. The roof on that one was rotted through. He was like a doctor reviewing the case histories of former patients, now fully recovered. Adler's success with Marshall Row encouraged him to go out and raise money for a revolving fund to be used by Historic Savannah to save other houses in the same way. The concept was very simple. Historic Savannah would use the money to buy endangered houses, then resell them at a loss, if necessary, to people who would sign a pledge to begin restoration within 18 months. The foundation set a goal of $200,000 for the fund, enough money in those days to save a lot of houses if they were turned over quickly enough. And they were. But even with the revolving fund, it was a struggle, said Adler. I come downtown every day and breathe in the air and plot out the day's fight. And it was indeed a fight because the buildings were still coming down pretty fast. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. And the voters of Savannah gave us no help at all. They rejected urban renewal 3 times because they thought it was a communist plot, and they defeated any number of proposals for historic zoning ordinances. That monstrosity over there, for instance, was one of our biggest losses, the Hyatt Regency Hotel. We were riding along Bay Street, passing in front of the Hyatt, a squat, modernist building next to City Hall. The Hyatt had been a great cause celeb in Savannah. The building had taken a great chunk out of the row of 19th century cotton warehouses along Factor's Walk, and its back side jutted out over River Street, interrupting the line of facades along the riverfront. The public battle over the hotel delayed its construction for 10 years. You can see the hotel is all wrong for the site, said Adler. We fought it in the courts, and let me tell you, it was a bruising battle. Both of the developers were members of Historic Savannah's foundation. The sister of one of them was the acting director. The organization was split right down the middle, practically destroyed. It was a very emotional time. I remember going to a wedding while all that was happening, and when I walked in, I realized I was suing everybody in the room but the bride and the minister. At about that time, restoration of the historic district was nearing completion. Over 1,000 houses have been restored. The work had been done by affluent whites, but Adler insisted that blacks had not been displaced. Historic Savannah was buying empty buildings for the most part, but when the supply of unrestored houses in the historic district began to dwindle, the next logical step was to restore the houses in the neighboring Victorian district, and that would have been a different story. We drove south on Albicorn Street. Within a few blocks, the restrained architecture of the historic district gave way to late Victorian flights of fancy. Big old wooden houses with romantic towers, gables, and elaborate gingerbread trim. A few were restored, but most were in very poor condition. The Victorian district was Savannah's first streetcar suburb. It had been built for the white working class between 1870 and 1910. After World War II, when the whites moved farther out into the suburbs, absentee landlords took over, and by 1975, the area had become a black slum. The houses were in deplorable shape, but they were still beautiful. And in recent years, speculators and upper-income whites started buying them. At that point, Adler became alarmed. It would have meant gentrification and massive displacements of blacks, he said, and I was determined to prevent that. I asked Historic Savannah to help find a way to restore this area without evicting the people who lived here. But the Historic Savannah was still busted up over the Hyatt, and they weren't interested in the housing problems of poor people. That's when I quit Historic Savannah. I launched a non-profit organization called the Savannah Landmark Rehabilitation Project, which had been a triumph because the board includes everybody, black, white, you name it, rich and poor. Adler's intention was to get houses out of the hands of the absentee slumlords and convert the Victorian district into a racially and economically diverse neighborhood. It occurred to him that the project might qualify for public assistance, and thus far, by using a combination of public and private funding, he had bought and renovated 300 units. Tenants paid 30% of their income in rent, and the rest was made up by the federal rent subsidies. I don't suppose I need to tell you, Adler said, that not everyone is happy about what we're doing here. Some people complain privately about poor blacks living in a subsidized housing so close to the historic district. A few people, like Jim Williams, have even spoken out publicly about it. Jim Williams says we're dealing with the criminal element. I take it you've heard of Jim Williams. Yes, I said I met him. Do you know about the Nazi flag incident? He told me about it, I said. He said he draped it over his balcony to interrupt a film being shot in Monterey Square. Well, that's right, said Adler. He had all those little faggots hanging the swastikas out there and moving it from window to window. On Anderson Street, Adler stopped in front of a freshly painted gray and white house. Now, I'm going to introduce you to an example of our so-called criminal element. We climbed the steps and Adler rang the bell. A black woman in a flowered house dress came to the door. "Morning, Ruby," said Adler. "Well, morning, Mr. Adler," she said. Adler introduced me to Mrs. Ruby Moore. "Ruby, I brought this gentleman to see what life is like in the Victorian district, if you don't mind." "Oh, that'll be just fine," she said pleasantly. "Come on in." Ruby Moore's duplex was cool inside. It had 3 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and high ceilings. There was a small garden in the back. A portrait of John F. Kennedy hung over the living room mantel. Adler let me on a quick tour upstairs and downstairs. Then we rejoined Mrs. Moore on the front hall. "These houses was pitiful before they was fixed over," she said. "I never dreamed they would look like this after they got through. While they was redoing them, I was over here every day looking, 'cause I knew I was going to get one. I really do appreciate my apartment. I really do. It's got central heat and air." "Is everything okay, Ruby?" Adler asked. "Oh, yes," she said. Then she turned to me. "Would you sign my book, please?" A guest book lay open on the table in the living room. As I signed my name, I noticed that I was not the first outsider to be brought to this house by Lee Adler. A reporter from the Atlanta Constitution had signed a few spaces above. We got back in the car. Adler told me that Ruby Moore qualified for one of his apartments because she was a longtime resident of the Victorian district, because she was a housekeeper at the Days Inn, and because her income was below a specific level. She paid $250 a month in rent, and federal subsidies covered the rest. Adler said that Mrs. Moore more than satisfied his inspection staff. Her house was always immaculate, and she was the rule rather than the exception. "We're not interested in housing the whores or the gamblers or the dope dealers," he said. We headed back into the historic district. I could show you another 100 apartments just like this one, but you probably get the picture. Once we got it going, private investors started buying houses, and property values began to rise. The Victorian district has been acclaimed as a national model for how to restore inner cities without uprooting the poor. We sponsored a national housing conference here in 1977, and 400 people came from 38 states. The next year, Rosalind Carter came down and taped a segment of Good Morning America in one of our renovated apartments. And this Friday, we're going to Washington to explain all of this to Prince Charles. We entered Monterey Square and swung around in counterclockwise, coming to a stop in front of Adler's own house. "Well, there you have it," he said. "Historic preservation used to be an elitist hobby, something rich dilettantes dabbled in, but we've turned it into grassroots operation. In the process, we created a 200 million tourist industry and brought people back downtown to live. Not bad, huh?" "Quite an accomplishment," I said. Adler looked at me over the top of his half-moon glasses. "It ain't bragging if you really done it." A week later, the Savannah Morning News published an account of the Adler's meeting with Prince Charles. Lee Adler was quoted saying that the prince showed a keen interest in the problem of cities. Emma Adler said the prince had asked marvelously intelligent, wonderful, and apt questions. 4 days later, the newspaper ran yet another article about the meeting, this one a first-person account written by Mrs. Adler. "It was a heavenly day in Washington," she wrote. "The sun was bright, the sky a deep blue, the weather was perfect for a suit." Once again, the Adlers were the topic of conversation in certain circles. The talk was nowhere more animated than at the meeting of the Married Women's Card Club on Tuesday night. "Do you suppose," said the woman in a blue taffeta dress, "that the newspaper had to twist Emma's arm to get her to write that article? Or do you think Emma twists the newspaper's arm to make them print it?" The woman's dress had a bow across the shoulders as big as wings. "Julia, you're wicked," said a woman wearing a black velvet headband and single pearl earrings. "No, I'm not," the woman in blue replied. "The Adlers could have kept their audience with Prince Charles a private matter if they wanted to, but they gone running to the newspapers as usual, and that changes things." "True. I mean, Emma could have restrained herself a little, don't you think? She sounds so prissy and pleased with herself." "Now, Julia," said the other woman, her voice dropping in volume, "I do believe you're jealous." The two ladies had not yet begun to play cards. In fact, they were still standing outside Cynthia Collins' front door, waiting to be admitted. That was one of the unusual rituals of the Married Women's Card Club. Married Woman, as if it was known for short, was one of Savannah's most exclusive societies. No other city had anything like it. It was founded in 1893 by 16 ladies in search of amusement during the day while their husbands were at work. There were always 16 members, no more, no less. Once a month, always on a Tuesday, they would gather at one of the members' houses for 2 hours of card playing, cocktails, and a light supper. 32 guests would be invited by engraved invitations so that the number of ladies in attendance always came to the 48. 12 card tables in all. According to custom, the ladies would arrive a few minutes before 4 in the afternoon, wearing white gloves, long dresses, and huge hats adorned with flowers or feathers. They did not ring the doorbell. Instead, they waited outside either in their cars or on the sidewalk until the hostess opened the door punctually at 4 o'clock. The ladies would then enter, sit down at the card table, and start playing at once. In the early years, they played whist or euchre or 500. Later, the games became auction bridge, then contract bridge. But for many years, there was always one table of whist, which, because Mrs. J.J. Rowers refused to learn how to play anything else. Once the ladies had begun playing, events proceeded according to a strict schedule that began with serving of a glass of water. Every member was given a printed copy of the schedule upon joining Married Women's. It read as follows: 4:15, water. 4:30, remove water. 4:40, empty ashtrays. 4:55, pass napkins. 5 o'clock, cocktails. 5:15, second cocktail. 5:30, third cocktail. 5:35, last hand, pass linen. 5:40, serve dinner plates. 5:45, high score and cut for aces. 6 o'clock, prizes. Ladies leave promptly. Being the hostess at one of these affairs was a serious matter. It was viewed as reason enough to paint the house or redecorate the parlor. At the very least, one took the silver out of the vault. As for keeping to the printed schedule, there was always a cadre of maids who knew the sequence of events better than the members did, and they would be loaned to nervous hostesses in order to ease their burden. The importance of the schedule was that it enabled the married women to get home in time to greet their husbands when they returned from work. Husbands were as much a part of married women as their wives. They were, after all, the one who footed the bill for the dinners and for refurbishing the house beforehand. And they were, of course, the major qualification for membership. A woman had to be married to belong. The rule stated that if a member obtained a divorce, she would be forced to resign and forfeit her dues. More than one marriage had been held together by that rule alone. In any case, 3 times a year, the hour for married women was moved from 4 to 7:30 so that the all-important husbands could attend. The men would wear black tie. On the Tuesday following the Adlers' return from Washington, husbands were invited to married women's. Mrs. Cameron Collins was the hostess for the evening. She and her husband lived with their 3 children in a townhouse on Oglethorpe Avenue. Men in black tie and women in long dresses began milling around the front of the house shortly before 7:30. I, too, had put on a black tie that evening, having been invited by Mrs. Collins. "I am not jealous of Emma Adler," said the woman in blue. "Not at all. I be the first to admit that Emma does a great many worthwhile things. She is an asset to the community, and if anybody deserves to meet Prince Charles, she does. It's just this grasping for recognition. It's so undignified." They always do it. You think Lee restored Savannah single-handedly. Lee loves basking in the limelight, and so does Emma. The woman turned to a man with thinning blonde hair, who was leaning casually against a tree with his hands in his pocket. "Darling," she said, "do you think I'm being unfair?" The man shrugged. "If you ask me, Emma Adler is a vast improvement over her mother." Emma Adler's mother was Emma Wattua Morrill, a large and domineering woman known around town as Big Emma. Big Emma was one of the richest people in Savannah. Being the largest stockholder in the Savannah Bank, she had a forceful personality. As one family friend put it, Big Emma was the sort of person who wasn't happy unless she had a table to pound on. Stories about her had become legend in Savannah. At home, she kept a padlock on the refrigerator to keep the help from stealing the food. She would get up from the table 10 or 15 times in the course of a dinner party to go into the kitchen and unlock and relock the refrigerator. Later on, after the guests had left, John Morrill would slip into the kitchen and tip the help generously in an effort to soothe feeling bruised from an evening of Big Emma's abuse. Well into her 90s, Big Emma could still be seen driving around Savannah at the wheels of her Mercedes limousine with her German Shepherd sitting next to her on the front seat and an ancient black chauffeur dressed in full livery sitting in back. The chauffeur, who had worked for Mrs. Morrill for more than 30 years and for her mother before that, was permitted to drive her smaller car, but not the Mercedes limousine. No one but Big Emma was permitted to drive that one. It was her exclusive domain. One recent noontime, she drove downtown to the headquarters of the Savannah Bank on Johnson Square to sign some papers. Before setting out, she had called ahead and told the bank's trust officer to meet her with the papers by the curb in front of the bank. She was in a hurry, she said, and did not want to be kept waiting. 20 minutes later, Big Emma turned the corner into Johnson Square, the massive German Shepherd sitting at her side and the old uniformed chauffeur cowering in the back. She drew up to the trust officer, but never quite came to the complete stop. The trust officer trotted alongside the limousine, handing papers through the window, pleading, "For heaven's sakes, Emma, stop the car." Big Emma glided along at 8 or 10 miles an hour, scribbling on paper and handing them back one by one. They were halfway around Johnson Square when she handed the last document back to the trust officer, rolled up the window, and sped off. Of all the tales told about Big Emma Morrill, the one most often repeated was her vociferous opposition to the marriage of her daughter to Lee Adler on the grounds that he was Jewish. Big Emma was vehement. She bellowed. She orated. She pounded on tables. She would not listen to arguments about John Morrill. Her own husband and little Emma's father was 1/4 Jewish himself. When little Emma stood her ground, Big Emma turned sullen. She refused to take her daughter to New York to buy her a wedding dress. Lee Adler's mother took her instead. At the wedding rehearsal, Big Emma stood as far away as she could from the wedding. She refused to let the Adlers join the receiving line. She froze them out. That episode was still remembered today 25 years later, and it was the reason why the man standing outside Cynthia Collins' house with his hands in his pocket compared Emma Adler favorably with her mother. At 7:30 on the dot, a beaming Cynthia Collins opened her front door wearing a long black dress and carrying a black lace fan. "Come on in, everybody," she said cheerfully. Her guests filled and wandered among the card tables set up in the living room and the dining room. As soon as they found their place cards, they sat down, and within minutes the tables were full. Conversation subsided to a muted hum, and the sound of shuffling cards swept through the house like autumn leaves blowing across a lawn. Not being a bridge player, I joined two other non-playing guests, a man and a woman, in a small library off the living room. The man had long white hair and a benevolent smile fixed on the face. He was, I gathered, a much respected figure in the community. The woman was perhaps 40 and smoked a pale blue cigarette. Across the room, two maids in crisp black and white uniforms stood beside pitchers of Manhattans, martinis, sherry and tea punch, and water. Cynthia Collins came into the room, flush-faced and smiling. "Well, the first rubber started on time, so I can catch my breath for a moment. I hope y'all didn't wait outside very long in that awful heat." "The curbside chatter was all about Lee and Emma," said the woman with the blue cigarette. "You know, I thought about Lee this afternoon," said Cynthia, "while I was writing out place cards for tonight. You still have to be careful who you put with whom because of the uproar over the Hyatt. Even now, we have Lee to thank for that, of course." "Don't remind me," said the other woman. "It was dreadful. At the height of it, you couldn't go to cocktail parties. You couldn't do anything. People got into such awful arguments. It was easier to just stay home. My sister-in-law and I are not on speaking terms to this day," the white-haired man said solemnly. "However, I must say I'm rather grateful for that." Cynthia Collins glanced discreetly at her watch. "Water," she whispered to the maids. "It's always all or nothing with Lee," said the other woman. "If he can't have his way, then nobody can. He follows a scorched earth policy." "And he does shout," said Cynthia. "My dear, he does more than that. Don't you remember that business with the gun?" "What gun?" "Lee had a disagreement with one of the other members of the board of the National Trust and pulled a pistol on him at a formal dinner. I think it was in Chicago a couple of years ago." "Oh, that's right," said Cynthia. "I forgot it, but it was a toy gun, as I remember. The way I heard it, Lee didn't actually accost the man. He presented the gun to him and suggested he shoot himself with it." "Well, maybe that was it," said the other woman. People were aghast. There had apparently been some kind of shooting in the poor man's family not long before, which made it positively ghoulish. Jimmy Biddle was president of the National Trust at the time. He stepped in and told Lee he was completely out of it and out of line and he should take his seat. It was all very tasteless and embarrassing. I guess that's what I was thinking about. The white-haired man sat back in his chair, casting his eyes from one woman to the other like a spectator at a tennis match. Cynthia turned to me. "We must sound very catty to you," she said, "but years ago Lee was our hero. We were his disciples. Because of Lee, we all moved downtown when it was still slummy and not very safe. It was exciting. The Hottridges even bought a townhouse next door to a whorehouse on John Street. And those days, Lee was doing something magnificent. He was an idealist and a purist. He was saving downtown. Of course, he didn't actually move downtown until much later. He and Emma stayed out in Osley Park where it was safe, while the rest of us moved downtown and pioneered the Cunninghams, the Kritzas, the Brannons, the Rangozzis, the Dunns. The whole board of historic Savannah lived downtown, except for Lee. The Allers didn't stick their necks out. They talked one game and played another, and now all he seems to care about are those damn awards and cozying up to people like Prince Charles." "Well, what happened?" I asked. He became impossible to deal with, said Cynthia. He was never much for democratic procedures in the first place. When he was president of Historic Savannah, he did just as he pleased and rarely consulted the board beforehand. It all came to a head with the Hyatt. We were all against that hotel. It was originally supposed to be a 15-story building that would have towered over City Hall. The whole board voted against it, including Lee. Then the board took a second vote on whether to make their opposition public. They voted to wait until they had a chance to talk with the developers, but Lee was adamant. He wanted a public confrontation right away. The board held firm. Since he didn't get his way, Lee decided to launch his own attack against the hotel. First, he withdrew his annual contribution to Historic Savannah, $7,000, which he earmarked for the director's salary. That was typical of Lee, by the way, to specify some high-profile use for his donation instead of giving money with no strings attached the way other people did. That's Lee, the one-man show. If he can't run it, he don't want any part of it. You can hardly blame the board for throwing him out of the Historic Savannah. My eyes pricked up at this. I thought it was Lee Adler who broke with Historic Savannah, I said, not the other way around. Lee was definitely voted out, said Cynthia, and what made it so poignant was that the people who voted him out were his friends and disciples, and the vote was unanimous. The minutes of that meeting had disappeared from the files mysteriously, but you can ask Walter Hartridge about it. He was president at the time. He and Connie are playing bridge in the next room. The saddest part, said the other woman, was the things would have worked out a whole lot better if Lee hadn't stirred things up on his own. At one point, the developers offered a compromise that was better than what we finally ended up with. I had the impression, I said, thinking back to what Adler had told me, that Adler quit Historic Savannah over a disagreement concerning housing for blacks in the Victorian district. At this, the other woman stubbed out her blue cigarette. I can't take it anymore, she said. It makes me so damn mad. Cynthia, I don't care where we are on the schedule. I'm ready for a drink. She went over to the table and poured herself a Manhattan. Lee Adler did not quit Historic Savannah. He was thrown out, said the woman. That was in 1969. He didn't start Savannah's landmark in the Victorian district until something like 5 years later. One had nothing to do with the other. Savannah's landmark is nothing but an ego trip. Of course, he pretends it's more noble than that. He portrays himself as a preservationist with a social conscience. He says he created a racially mixed neighborhood. Bull. He created a new black ghetto. It's not true integration. It's segregation all over again. Lee was devastated when he was forced out of the Historic Savannah. He'd been president for 6 years. It was his life. He had to show Historic Savannah that he could do it on his own somehow, and he seized on the Victorian district as his vehicle. He hit on a scheme to use government money to buy and restore historic houses for subsidized tenants. It had nothing to do with pious social aims. It was just a way of financing a preservation project with himself at the head of it. He says he's restoring houses without displacing longtime residents, as if the Victorian district was historically black or even mixed. Well, it wasn't. Until the middle of the 1960s, it was a white middle-class neighborhood. If Lee hadn't been so damn stuck on himself, the private marketplace would have taken care of the Victorian district. And believe me, blacks would still have been well represented downtown. Public housing is needed, I'll grant you, but the Victorian district is about the worst place for it. The woman explained that the houses in the Victorian district were mostly wood-frame dwellings, which meant that the fire insurance was very high and that the houses had to be repainted every 3 years or so because the intense humidity made the paint run and peel quickly. Costs like that are indefensible in publicly subsidized housing, she said. And Lee's not doing fine restoration work at all, she went on. He's gutting the houses and ripping out nice little Victorian touches, like stamp-tilled ceilings. He's not keeping the houses in good shape. Take a look at them, all of them, not just the few he liked to show off. The paint is peeling, the porch railings are broken. 2 or 3 years after they've been restored, his houses blend right in with the unrestored houses next to them. Through the door, I could see the maids moving from table to table, collecting the empty water glasses. And if I may be so bold, the woman went on, what's so damn awful about gentrification? Gentrification was fine with Lee when it suited him in the historic district. He stopped gentrification all right, and he's also killed real estate values in the Victorian district. It's a buyer's market, but there are no buyers. In the name of preservation, Lee Adler has stopped preservation cold. But Adler had told me, I said, that restoration in the Victorian district had encouraged private investment there. Well, that's a flat-out lie, and no one knows it better than Lee Adler. One of his sons bought a house on Walberg Street and restored it magnificently, but when the time came to sell it, there weren't any takers. His asking price was $135,000. Now it's down to $97,000, and still nobody wants it because it is smack dab in the middle of Black Slum. Outside Savannah, said Cynthia, people think the Victorian district has been a great success because that's what Lee tells them. They all swallow his lines. Prince Charles is just the latest in a long line of chumps. What's really irritating, the other woman said, is the way the Adlers have set themselves up as moral arbitrators. It makes me want to scream. I'm tired of Lee's noble pretensions, and I'm sick of Emma Eleanor Roosevelt Act. What have we done to deserve it? Plenty, said the white-haired man. The two women looked at the man in surprise. He was still smiling his benevolent smile. Lee is prominent member of Savannah society, is he not? The man asked gently. He belongs to the Cotillion Club, which sponsors the debutante balls. He's one of the 15 distinguished gentlemen in the Madeira Club, where he and the others deliver learned papers over Epicurean dinners and fine Madeira wines. He belongs to the Cheltenham Club, where he can go for drinks and dinner and look out over the rooftops of the historic district he's been so instrumental in preserving. The two women nodded cautiously, unsure what the man was driving at. He plays golf at the Savannah Golf Club, the man went on, so Lee Adler is one of Savannah's elite. At least you would think so, but he isn't really, is he? In Savannah, we have our little way of drawing the line of saying, you shall come this far and no farther. You are not really one of us. We have the Oglethorpe Club as our way of saying this, and we have the Yacht Club. The man spoke softly, like a kindly professor. Lee Adler is Jewish. A great many of his good friends belong to the Oglethorpe Club and the Yacht Club, but he does not. But the Oglethorpe Club does admit Jews, said the woman. Bob Minus is in the member. Yes, Bob is one of the oldest members of the Oglethorpe Club, and he's very well liked. He's also the great-great-grandson of the first white child born in Georgia, which makes him a living relic of Georgia history. He's Jewish, but not overly Jewish. Both of his wives have been Christians, and so have most of his friends, and his children have been raised as Episcopalians. Bob gives good value as a member of the Oglethorpe Club. Apart from being delightful company, he enables us to say, as you have just said, but we do have Jews in the Oglethorpe Club. The man folded his arms and looked at each of us in turn, as if to assure himself that his point had been received. On the other hand, he went on, there is Lee Adler, cold-shouldered by the Oglethorpe Club and tossed out of historic Savannah. What is he to do? He must do something brilliant, something absolutely ingenious. In my opinion, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Through his work in the Victorian district, he has not only made a comeback as a historic preservationist, he has wrapped himself in a morally unaccessible issue: housing for poor blacks. If you oppose him, you'll look like a racist. Lee Savannah's landmark project may be unrealistically expensive. His restorations may be shoddy. He may have depressed real estate values a bit in the Victorian district. He may have created a new black ghetto. He may even be in it, as some people suspect, for the money and the recognition, but nobody can stand up and say so, and that's why it's so brilliant. Lee Adler has achieved his objective. He has regained his position as one of America's leading preservationists, and in the process he has rubbed our noses in the ensue of races. I don't believe he's sincere about blacks, said the woman with the blue cigarette. Not one of the clubs Lee belongs to, at least none you've mentioned, has ever had any black members. True, said the man, and for that matter I suspect the blacks themselves may wonder if Lee and Emma are sincere. For instance, if you read Emma's newspaper article about Prince Charles carefully, you will see something very curious. Emma twits the members of the Washington Press Corps who were presented at the meeting for being interested only in frivolous speculation about Prince Charles rather than the issue of housing. But then she carries on at great length about the sweet black cook she took with her and how the cook had made a basket out of pine needles for the prince and that she had worried for weeks about how to present it to him. Emma did not find fault with the cook's somewhat childlike preoccupation with her basket, though the basket didn't have anything to do with the issue of housing either. Emma appears to have a double standard, one for educated journalists and one for simple black cooks. From this, one might draw the conclusion that Emma has a patronizing attitude towards blacks. A satisfied smile spread across the face of the woman with the blue cigarette. She said. I think the blacks know where they stand with Lee and Emma. The man went on. They also know probably that no one here tonight has renovated 300 apartments for poor blacks or taken their black cooks to meet Prince Charles. The blacks know that the Adlers are doing something for them, whatever their motives may be. And in return, the blacks are doing something for the Adlers. What on earth are they doing for the Adlers? Asked the woman. They're giving the Adlers their vote, he said. In the last election, you may remember that Lee and Emma supported Spencer Lawson for district attorney against Busby Ryan. The Adlers were among the largest contributors to Lawton's campaign. One can assure Lee passed the word to the black ministers that he was supporting Lawton. Presto, the Black Ministerial Alliance, which had been backed by Ryan in the past, switched over to Lawton. Lawton won the black vote, and the black vote gave him his margin of victory. So whether he planned it or not, Lee Adler emerged from his crisis with a black power base, and with the district attorney grateful to him for his help. This makes Lee a political power. It makes it impolitic for any city official to oppose Lee in any of his little housing ventures. The man raised his eyebrows as if to say, I rest my case. Well, I do see your point, the woman said dryly. The man then looked over at Cynthia Collins, but at the moment Mrs. Collins was stealing a glance at her watch. A flicker of concern crossed her brow. She caught the eye of the maid by the door. Pass napkins, she whispered.